So, in both Matthew and Mark, we get a different account of Jesus' final moments than we get from Luke. And in John, we get a different account of Jesus' final moments than we get from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this leaves us with a big question, which is, of course, doesn't that mean they contradict each other because they're giving us different accounts? And the simple answer is no, there's no contradictions. And this is because in both Matthew and Mark, we learn that while he's on the cross, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And right after this, in Matthew 27 and Mark 15, Jesus gets mocked, then soldiers give Jesus a sponge filled with sour wine, and then Jesus cries out, gives up his spirit, and breathes his last. So, right there in Matthew and Mark, you learn that my God, why have you forsaken me?" is not the final statement made by Jesus on the cross. Now, this fits perfectly with Luke and John's account of things, because John tells us that Jesus said, "It is finished," and then bowed his head and gives up his spirit. And Luke tells us that Jesus said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit," and then he breathes his last. So, just for a quick recap, Matthew and Mark tell us that Jesus gets mocked, then soldiers give Jesus a sponge filled with sour wine, then Jesus cried out and gives up his spirit and breathes his last. Meanwhile, John tells us Jesus said, "It is finished," then bows his head, then gives up his spirit. Luke tells us that Jesus gives up his spirit and breathes his last. So if we put this all onto a timeline, Matthew and Mark tell us that Jesus gets mocked, then Jesus gets some sour wine given to him, then Jesus gives up his spirit and dies. And according to John, Jesus says it is finished, and then he gives up his spirit. And according to Luke, Jesus gives up his spirit, and then Jesus dies. So if we put all of these together, we actually don't get multiple contradictory stories, but rather we get a single coherent story told from different perspectives, which actually increases the credibility of the New Testament. And this is a very important thing to notice, because people like this will try to have you believe there's a contradiction in the New Testament when this is simply not true. And as a matter of fact, all four gospel authors all agreed on the events that happened during Jesus' final moments on the cross. And Matthew, Mark, and John say that Jesus gave up his spirit, and then they don't explicitly state what his final words are. Meanwhile, Luke says Jesus gave up his spirit, and then Luke also explicitly states the last cry that was mentioned in the other Gospels, even though they don't explicitly state what the last cry is.